This is Secular Founding Period History, and my name is Tony Messina. Welcome to another presentation of America's Lost History and Understanding the Establishment Clause. The American Bipolar Political Religious Philosophies of the Founding Period, 1776 to 1791. What you are looking at here are the locations of the two diametrically opposed political religious views of the founding period, one in which the church is separated from the state, and the other is one in which the state is a tool of the church. In Virginia, the Anglican Church was separated from the state government, and as Jefferson said, the forbearance of repairing to church, it was returned back to the people where the churches belong, thusly separating the church from the state, and non-church-based representatives are elected by the people despite their religion. While in states to the east, Puritan Congregationalists controlled most of New England's political religious affairs through filtered representatives who are elected as members exclusively from the state's Congregationalist Church of Christ churches, a one-party system much like communism. And now we will look at the very constitutional language that makes all this a fact. Starting with this chart, plotting the evolution of establishment of religion and non-preferentialism in adopted documents from 1776 to 1791. What you're looking at here is a chart that plots the mentions in state constitutions between 1776 to the federal constitution of 1791. That which is federal is below the big line that points to the right, and that which is above it is state. Okay. As you read through these clauses from these constitutions, certain things become quite obvious, and I'm going to show you some of these things as we go through the process with this particular illustration. Okay, what I'm showing you here in the green and red sections is that the green from southern states has language that's considerably similar. It's almost like the cookie cutter. Someone wrote it and another state saw it and they wrote it and maybe changed a word or two, and then another state saw it. Then we have language that comes from New England, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire in the red, and its language is interestingly similar for those two states. If you take a close look at it, and we're going to do that, you're going to see that they point in a certain direction. They imply certain meaning. What you see here is the two poles, the bipolar, if you will, of the totally different, diametrically opposed political, religious perspectives of the founding period. You have states in the South, basically the Anglican-influenced states, that once we gained our independence, they had no more state church. They got rid of the state of England and its church. So these states could take measures to separate the church from the state, and some of these states put language in their constitutions that would be pointed in the direction of separating the church from the state, such as clauses in the green that you see here. Okay. Then you have the absolute diametrically opposed perspective that comes from New England. What happened was 76 gave us separation of church and state language that was adopted in 76, and then 4 years later, Massachusetts and New Hampshire had a chance to see this language and think about what's going on down there and the evil of separation of church and state, which is exactly what they thought about separation of church and state in New England. So they deliberately, and just like little children, little babies that can't handle really what you should be doing in your state, like little babies, they created language that is exactly the opposite of separating the church from the state. They had no intention of separating the church from the state in New England. In fact, if you mention the very phrase of separation of church and state to a New Englander, they would laugh in your face in that period, I can assure you. And again here I'm emphasizing this bipolar political, religious, philosophical view that was existing in the founding period. It was actually between New England and other than New England states. Yes, the language that you see here in red and green is the foundation of the bipolar political religious philosophies of the founding period. And we're going to examine this language very closely now. But first we're going to resolve the states that have gray shaded clauses, straighten those out and figure out if those clauses are representing a separation of church and state or otherwise. Take notice that New York actually has a clause that incorporates both of the words of the bipolar political religious philosophies, and it happens to be, though, that in New York, their state constitution absolutely separated the church from the state. New York was, next to Virginia, New York was the only state to actually surgically and verbally, with clauses and documents, separate the church from the state. So New York is actually a green state. It is a separation of church type of state. Therefore, it is in the green. And the next state we'll talk about is South Carolina, where clearly one can see that Carolina is a Christian state. It has the clause in it, "The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed and is hereby constituted and declared to be the established religion of this state." So clearly, South Carolina is not a state where there is separation of church and state. Therefore, South Carolina is colored red. Now, let's talk about Pennsylvania, where we find Pennsylvania gives us the clause that no preference shall ever be given by law to any religious establishment or modes of worship. So, clearly, Pennsylvania has language that separates the church from the state. However, Pennsylvania has a constitution that has a clause in it that doesn't separate the church from the state. However, the language you see here does imply separation of church and state in Pennsylvania. So for Pennsylvania, this one clause will be colored green. And next, in the federal level there, we see the 1791 Bill of Rights was adopted. This ended the 1776 to 1791 period. And they give us the clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The various establishments of religion that the states had were protected by this clause. Under Articles of Confederation, there was no concern about establishing religion at the federal level then, so why would there be with the new federal Constitution? What would change? It would have been state establishments of religion that always existed, and it would be the states were looking for hands-off language, and that's what they get with the Establishment Clause. The people were not citizens of the federal government. The people were citizens of the states, and the states is where the establishing of religion would go on because it has people under it for which it establishes religion for. The federal government had no citizens. It had no reason to establish religion. It had no reason to bother with religion. But it could turn around and tell a state what it could or could not do regarding religion, like for example if the Danbury Association had appealed to the federal government for redress of grievance because of the way they're treated in their state when it comes to religion, the federal government could, on behalf of the Danbury Association, have made a law that would have changed the way business is done in Connecticut. Do you think Connecticut would like that? No, Connecticut would not like that. So Connecticut would really benefit from a clause that reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion that exists in Connecticut. Okay, this depiction shows us on the left we have the states are now colored in. If they're red, they didn't separate the church from the state. If they're green, they did. You can see on the right I have the arrows pointing to each one of the clauses coming from each state. indicating whether or not that's language that separates the church from the state, and you can clearly see that some of the states had language that would be indicative of separating the church from the state, while other states did not. And the relationship between church and state in the New England states involved an individual known as the tithe man, and it was his job to go around and make sure everyone tithed. And they also had another individual that was called the censor, and his job was to oversee moral order and church attendance. Let's get familiar with the language here. In the New England states, they would say, no subordination of any sect be established. In the southern states, it was no establishment of any sect in preference. Okay, so they both had a directional view about religion and the state. It's just that in the South, they separated it from the state and made no preference of it, while in the New England states, the church was established, and it was not going to be any subordination of any sect to another going on in New England. Okay, now here we're going to emphasize. You can see that the word subordination would really be something that would have to do with an arrow pointing down, to subordinate, while preference would be an arrow pointing up, something that was preferred. We're going to continue to piece this together and show you exactly what's going on with these two bipolar political religious perspectives. Notice that it says, there should be no establishment of any one religious sect in this state in preference to another. Okay, now look, follow me with this. Using the four churches on the right, all sitting on the bar of equality, we're going to demonstrate the opposite. We're going to demonstrate the establishment of one sect in preference of another, as it was before 1776, so we can get a visual of what's going on here. Okay, in the area below there, we see the equal sign. It's showing that all the churches are equal. They're all on the same level. They're all on the bar of equality and the law. Okay, some words about the law here. The law is an inanimate object. It's words on a paper. The law can be both good or bad. Laws can be written for good reasons, and they can be written for reasons of discrimination. Nonetheless, it's the law. So the law is just kind of like a dum-dum. It's there. It doesn't know if it's doing good or doing bad. It just depends on the people that write the laws, okay? You can write laws that bring about equality, like you see here on the bottom right. You have an equal situation. And then we're going to show you in a second where you can write a law that makes it legal to be unequal, to discriminate. Above the Supreme Court building, there is a quote that says, equal justice under law. Unfortunately, someone invented that quote was really stupid, because laws are made all the time based on inequality, and you can't possibly have justice with laws that are made based on inequality. But if the law is made based on inequality, when it is applied equally. So you can have equal justice under unequal laws. It's just the equal justice is unfair equal justice. Much like Jim Crow laws were made unfairly, they were applied fairly. Black people got what was coming to them according to the law, and white people got what was coming to them according to that law. So the Jim Crow laws were unequal laws that were applied fair and equally. Which brings me full circle back to the point that if you want social equality, you have to have laws made based on equality. If you don't have laws made based on equality, your quote of equal justice under law is nothing more than a mindless quote. Laws made based on equality give us justice. That's a better quote right the hell there. And here we can see that a benign law was made that brought about inequality. The law didn't know it did that. It was the people that made the law. And here we see the bar of inequality exists where the state-established Anglican Church has been elevated or preferred to the others. So this illustration gives us the visual understanding of one sect being established over another. Okay, as we can see here, religious sect number 2 was preferred over all other religious sects and became the state-established sect. Religious sects numbers 1, 3, and 4 are all not established. Now let's look at the New England version of this. Okay, in New England, we're going to start by pointing out it says, no subordination of any one sect or denomination to another shall ever be established by law. Using the four churches on the right, all sitting on the bar of equality, we're going to demonstrate the opposite. We're going to demonstrate the subordination of one sect or denomination to another as established by law, the way it was in the founding period. Okay, what we see here is we see the equal sign, and all the churches are equal on the bar of equality and the law. Now let's see what happens when we subordinate one sect to the others. Okay, what you see here is an illustration that represents the New England version of church and state. As we can see here, religious sect number 2 was made subordinate to all other religious sects because it was not a state-approved church, and thusly it became the state unestablished sect. Religious sects number 1, 3, and 4 are all still established, thusly they are all 3 state-established churches. You can see in the depiction the bar of inequality. We've had sect number 2 was subordinated in relation to the other sects. But first we're going to talk about the subordination of a sect, okay? The state unestablished sects included the Danbury Baptists. In Connecticut, the Danbury Baptists were subordinated. They were a state unestablished sect, and we're going to read a letter from them in just a moment to get a clear idea of what they had to deal with in Connecticut. But also in New England, the Catholics, until a period somewhere, were hated by New Englanders, and in fact the Louisiana Purchase was problematic because a lot of New Englanders did not like the fact that it was a Catholic territory. Okay, we also had anti-Quakerism too in New England, so there's a lot of subordination of religious sects in New England going on. Okay, a quick summation of what we have here. We have the subordination of churches in like New England, where we had the subordination of the Baptists and the Catholics and the Quakers, and we have examples of the establishment of one sect in preference to another with the Virginia establishment of the Anglican denomination as the state church. So we can see that in both situations here, they were both by law positioned this way, so the law didn't know that it was doing bad. It's just who made the law that way. That's what you need to look at. And then what do you need to do to make the law equal? That's what you need to check out. The quote above the Supreme Court is equal justice under law. But that's a perversion, because laws can be made based on inequality, and then when they're applied, they are being applied based on equality, but when they're made based on inequality, they're going to be applying an unequal measure of justice. And here we have the very words of the Danbury Association to Jefferson extracted. Our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty, that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbor. But, sir, in our state of Connecticut, religion is considered as the first object of legislation, and therefore what religious privileges we enjoy as favors granted, not as inalienable rights, and these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men. And then following here we have another comment by Jefferson, said this about establishments of religion. But every state has established some religion. No two, say I, have established the same. Is this proof of the infallibility of establishments? Okay. There's many establishments of religion, not just a state church or a state religion. There's many different ways to establish religion. Jefferson teaches us earlier when he says that every state has established some religion, no two the same. This is exactly what he's talking about here. Religious establishments include, but are not limited to, a state church, state religion, a state denomination, state articles of faith or modes of worship, ministers in the military, ministers in the House and Senate, pre-session prayers in any or all government meetings, proclamations of days of fasting, prayer, thanksgiving, both direct and indirect religious tests for office, special laws and tax-exempt status for churches and ministers, special unconstitutional powers granted to religious institutions, paying taxes for teachers of the Christian religion, being required to tithe to your particular church of choice, being required to fulfill state tithing laws, being required to obey Sabbatarian blue laws, religious statues erected on government property, the Ten Commandments at taxpayer expense, forced public school prayer, government prayer breakfast at taxpayer expense, and many more, i.e. prison ministries, hand on Bible oaths. These are all examples of establishments of religion. Adopting any of these at the state level is an establishment of religion, whether you like it or not, believe it or not, or know it or not. These are all examples of establishments of religion. Okay, we have two paragraphs here to surmise the political religious philosophies of New England contrasted with that of Virginia. Okay, we're going to start here with New England. Political religious philosophy of New England works like this. First, we have the Christian people come together and founded their church and named it the Church of Christ, and this would eventually become the state church. Over time, the number of Church of Christ churches increased to accommodate a constantly increasing number of members. This increase went from one little Church of Christ church to Church of Christ churches spread out over a large area. In an attempt to unite and maintain some order and communication between all of these Church of Christ churches, there was a general government created to assist in this that eventually became the state government. The state government of Connecticut, for example, began this way. The state government tended the needs of the state church and the people of those churches, the Church of Christ. In this social arrangement, only church members of the state churches are allowed to be elected to office, and a Protestant religious test is required to maintain state unity and purity in religion. The political religious philosophy of Virginia works like this. First, we have the people come together and agree to a legal and binding democratic constitution, an act of self-determination by the people, written on the broadest bottom to include everyone. The people establish a government that is considered to be a servant of the people. By the establishment in the Constitution of a broad base of individual rights, all of our citizens enjoy the freedom and equality it offers. This is done best by separating the churches of many and varying denominations from the state. And we do this by making no mention of religion in our Constitution regarding a state church or religion being any business of the legislature, and the churches being anything more than a privilege like all corporations, ecclesiastical or otherwise. To resist the social chaos and faction and facilitate the separation of church and state, ministers of the gospel were prohibited from elected office, and also eventually there was no religious test required for public office. This is Secular Founding Period History, and my name is Tony Messina.